Imagine, the room is quiet, too quiet. The candles barely flicker, the air is heavy, and the family stands still as if waiting for permission to breathe. In the center is a person. She is no longer breathing. But ask the photographer, please, don't move. Shocking fact. In Victorian Britain, death was the beginning of a photo shoot. This is not a strange thing. This is not a legend. It was the practice. Sometimes it was the last chance to have a portrait of someone who had already passed away. Why did families pose next to the dead? Why did they apply makeup? And what did the person feel when they looked into the camera, knowing that before them was not life? Today we will go to where grief became an image, when the portrait became the last. Death in the Victorian era was not a rare event. It was not hidden in the sterile walls of hospitals. It lived nearby, in houses, in bedrooms, in children's cradles. 19th century London was a city where life was bustling, but often short-lived. Illnesses came quickly. Doctors were not always in time, and farewells sometimes took place before the family had time to realize the loss. It is difficult for us to accept this today, but then death was part of the domestic space. The body remained in the house. It was washed. It was dressed. It was prepared for burial, in the same place where the person lived yesterday, without separation, without distance. And in the midst of this closeness, a strange practice for modern man was born: post-mortem photography. A world without photographs. We live in a world where every day there are dozens of pictures, telephone, selfies, random shots. In the 19th century, everything was different. Photography was an event, a luxury, sometimes the only image of a person in their entire life. Long exposures, static poses, complex technical processes. Portraits were not taken as a keepsake. They were taken as evidence of existence. And here is the paradox. Many people did not have a single photo during their lifetime, but they received it after death. The last chance to see. For the family, it did not look like something terrible. It was an act of love. The last opportunity to capture a face, to preserve features, to stop what can no longer be returned, especially when it came to children. Victorian infant mortality was a terrible reality. A child could live for several months and disappear from life as quietly as it had appeared. And if the photo was not taken during life, there was only one chance left. The room that became a studio. Imagine this scene: dark curtains drawn, candles carefully arranged, a chair or a small bed, and the body. It was laid out as if a person was simply sleeping, and sometimes seated, supported by hidden holders. The head was fixed with special stands. Photography required immobility, and death provided it perfectly. The cruel irony of the era. Smiles that scare us today. The biggest shock for the modern viewer is not the fact of a posthumous photograph, but the facial expressions. Relatives sometimes stand nearby and not crying, not screaming, not looking broken, sometimes even barely perceptibly smiling. Why? Because Victorian photography is a world of formality, a world of long poses, a world where a serious or calm expression was the norm. A smile did not mean joy. It could mean restraint, dignity, or simply an attempt to look proper. But to us, it looks like something disturbingly wrong. The living among the dead. Posthumous photographs were rarely taken in isolation. A child in the arms of its mother, a husband next to his wife, the family around the coffin. Death was not separated. It was included in family memory, not as horror, but as fact. The fine line between sleep and death. Photographers often tried to erase the obviousness of death. Eyes could be painted on the negative. Cheeks were painted. The pose was as alive as possible. The idea was simple and painful, to make it seem as if a person had simply frozen in peace, as if the dream was continuing. But what was hidden behind it? Behind this practice was not only grief. There was the fear of oblivion, the fear that the face would disappear, that memory would dissolve, that time would erase everything without a trace. Photography became a barrier against disappearance. And the question that is uncomfortable: if you lived then, in a world without thousands of images, in a world where death comes often and suddenly, would you agree to such a portrait? Would you be able to stand next to it? Would you be able to look into the camera? The art of looking alive. Photography in the 19th century did not forgive mistakes. Long exposure, fragile light, absolute immobility. Even for a living person, it was difficult to sit still for a few minutes. But for a dead person, dead is perfect. And yet photographers faced a problem. Death looks like death, and the families wanted something different. They wanted to see not the body, but the person, a body that needed to be prepared. Before the shooting, a process began that today sounds almost like makeup in a theater. Hair was styled, clothes were adjusted, faces were corrected. After death, the skin quickly lost its vibrant tone. It became dull, cold, and this is where makeup came into play. A light blush, shadow on the cheeks, sometimes painted lips. Not for beauty, for the illusion of life. Eyes that no longer look. The eyes were the most difficult. Closed, too obvious a sign of death. Open, almost impossible to keep natural. The solution? Sometimes they were painted over, directly on the negative, neatly, almost imperceptibly. Eyes that had never seen the photographer, but now looked out of the portrait. Poses that denied death. Posthumous photos rarely sought to show death openly. On the contrary, the child was laid down as if she were sleeping. The man was seated in an armchair. The woman at a table with a book. The pose said, "He is just resting." But something in these images always betrayed the truth. Excessive immobility, unnatural silence in the body, barely noticeable rigidity, death as a role of life. Sometimes the photograph became almost a stage, a dead child among living brothers and sisters. The same hairstyles, the same dresses, one family, one frame. But one person is already beyond the limit. The 21st century viewer feels discomfort, almost anxiety. But for them it was an act of memory, not strange, not cruel, necessary. The photographer as a master of illusion. The photographer in this story is not just a technician. He is a director. He decides where the light falls, what angle will hide the rigidity, what shadow will make the face softer. He creates the last image of a person, sometimes more alive than the reality itself in front of him. Invisible holders. Special supports were used to keep the body sitting. Metal clamps, hidden behind the back, invisible in the frame. The head, which could not hold itself up, remained flat. The body, which had no tone, looked composed. Photography demanded discipline, even from death. The line that was erased. Over the years, the line between the living and the dead in the photo became almost invisible. Barely noticeable signs. Barely a glimpse. Barely unnatural calm. Sometimes, modern researchers argue, is this person alive or dead? The frame does not always give the answer. And here, fear is born, because photography is proof. If death can be made to look like life, then where is the guarantee that we see reality correctly? A question that sounds quiet. If you lost someone at that time, and you were told, we can make it look like they're just sleeping, would you agree? Children who will never grow up. In Victorian England, childhood was fragile. Dangerously fragile. Infections, fevers, measles, scarlet fever, diseases that are often treated today sounded like a death sentence back then. A child could be healthy in the morning and dead by night, without warning, without time to say goodbye. A family's greatest fear. The death of a child is not just grief, it is the destruction of a future. Unspoken words, unlived years, and the terrible silence in a room where laughter had rung out yesterday. Many parents never had a single portrait of their child during their lifetime. A photograph was expensive, rare, not a priority. And when the child was gone, only one possibility remained: a posthumous portrait as the only memory. For a modern person, this sounds scary, but for them it was almost a sacred act. The final proof. She was. He existed. We remember. The image of a sleeping angel. Children were often photographed as if they were simply sleeping, in a crib, among pillows, with a favorite toy. Soft light, a calm pose. Death was disguised as sleep, not to deceive, to relieve pain, the illusion of life. Sometimes the child was seated, supported, fixed. The eyes could be painted over. The cheeks were slightly tinted. A photo that was supposed to say, "Look, she's almost alive." But almost is the most painful word. Brothers and sisters in the frame. Often there were living children standing nearby, equally, seriously, sometimes confused. They didn't always understand death the way adults do. For them, it could be a strange silence, a strange game of immobility, a strange day when everyone behaves differently, and the photograph captured it forever. The living next to someone who will never wake up again. A mother who doesn't let go. There are shots that are still hard to bear to look at. A mother holding a child in her arms. A look into the camera. The face is calm, but the eyes often give away everything. The abyss of loss. Tired shock. The same question that has no answer. How could this happen? Photography as grief therapy. A posthumous portrait became part of the farewell process, a way to accept reality, a way to see the child again, not in motion, not in life, but in image. Silence after the shutter click. The photograph is complete. The exposure is over. The photographer lowers his head, and the room becomes what it once was, a place of loss. The truth that scares. For many families, this photo was the first, the last, the only. A question that cannot be ignored. If you had no picture of your child, no evidence of their face, and you were offered one, only chance, would you agree? The photographer who worked with death. He didn't come for holidays, not for weddings, not for birthdays. He was called when the house was already quiet. A photographer. A man whose profession in the Victorian era was something between a craft, an art, and a test of nerves. A visit to a house of mourning, the door opened quietly, without further ado. The house smelled of wax, fabric, sometimes medicine. The clock was ticking. People were talking in whispers. And somewhere in the room, a body was waiting. The photographer became part of this space, an almost invisible presence in the midst of grief. Not just a camera. His equipment was bulky, a tripod, a wooden camera, glass plates. The settings took time. The light required precision, and the entire room obeyed one rule: don't move anything. Professional coolness. The photographer had to remain calm, even if there was a dead child in front of him, even if there were parents nearby, barely holding on. His hands shouldn't shake, because the exposure is long, because there's only one shot, because a mistake is irreparable. The director of the last image. He decided how to position, how to turn the head, where to direct the gaze of the living. Sometimes he literally created the illusion of the presence of life. Stands, fixers, shadows that hide rigidity. Death became a composition, the limit of emotions. Were photographers used to this? Some did, others didn't. Historical records mention those who avoided such commissions. Those who, after several years of working with death, lost sleep. Because a portrait is one thing, and a portrait of someone who will never blink again is quite another. The silent contract. There was an unspoken contract between the family and the photographer. He doesn't ask unnecessary questions. They don't show excessive emotions. Everything is restrained. Everything is dignified. Everything is as it should be. Victorian culture did not encourage the chaos of feelings in a public gesture. Even at the moment of death, the click of the shutter, the moment of truth, a few seconds or minutes, no one breathes, no one moves, and the photographer captures something that can no longer be changed. The last image of a person. After the shoot, he puts away the equipment. He thanks, he leaves, and the family stays, with the body, and with a strange feeling that death has just become an image, the dark side of the craft. And here a difficult question arises. Where is the line between memory and commerce, between compassion and profession? Because for the photographer, it was work, an order, payment, process. And for the family, a moment that tore life in half, a look into the past. Today, these photographs look at us from museums, archives, collections, and we often see horror in them. But the photographer saw something else then: the task, the light, the frame. And a question for you: would you be able to do such work? Day after day, entering houses where death has not yet had time to cool down. Look through the viewfinder and focus on the face of someone who has already left. Smile that is misunderstand. A modern viewer looks at Victorian posthumous photos and feels an almost instinctive discomfort. Something seems wrong. Not because of death, but because of the faces of the living. Why aren't they crying? The mother stands nearby. The father looks into the camera. The brother, the sister. And no one looks as broken as we expect. Sometimes, a barely perceptible smile. And our 21st century brain reacts sharply. How is this possible? A different language of emotions. But the Victorian era lived by different rules for expressing feelings. Photography then was a formal event, long exposure, a difficult pose, an image that had to look restrained and dignified. Wide smiles were rare, even in ordinary portraits of the living. Seriousness equals norm. Calmness equals decency. Smile does not equal joy. What we read as joy today could mean something completely different back then. Restraint, control, a socially acceptable mask. In a world where public behavior had strict boundaries, even grief often wore a corset. The photo as a ritual, not a moment. A posthumous portrait was not a spontaneous scene. It was almost a rite of passage. People were posed, aligned, composed. Facial expressions did not always reflect emotion. They met the requirements of photographic culture. A frozen moment. Remember, the exposure was long. Any movement is a blur. Any tremor is a ruined shot. The face had to be still. Sometimes this created a strange effect. People look neither alive nor sad, but frozen. Almost the same as the body next to it. Psychological protection. And another truth, less obvious. Grief does not always look like tears. Sometimes it is shock, numbness, detachment. A person can stand next to a tragedy and look almost calm, because the psyche protects itself. What we see. We look through centuries, without context, without the smells of that room, without understanding the norms of the era. And that is why we read these photos as something eerie. And for them, it was an act of memory, not horror, not sensation, a smile near death. Does this mean that no one suffered? No. This means only one thing. A photograph does not always show the truth of emotion. It shows the truth of the pose. The most disturbing effect, and this is where the special fear of the modern viewer is born, because it feels as if death had become commonplace, as if tragedy had become commonplace. But the truth is more complicated. Death was indeed closer to life, and less hidden. The question that remains: if you lived in a culture where restraint is more important than the demonstration of pain, would you look different in such a photo? Beautiful death. Makeup, clothes, the illusion of peace. Death in the Victorian era was not only photographed, it was decorated. Not as a spectacle, but as the last image of a person. Preparing for farewell. Before burial, the body was not left as is. It was washed, combed, dressed in the best clothes. It was an act of respect. And at the same time, an attempt to regain control in a situation where everything was already irretrievably lost. Makeup after death. The skin quickly lost its vibrant color. Pallor appeared. Shadow. Cold, waxy tone. And then cosmetic techniques were used. Light blush. Softening of shadows. Sometimes lip correction. Not for aesthetics, for peace. So that the person does not look dead, but quiet. The illusion of sleep. One of the main ideas of posthumous photography, death as a dream. The body was placed as if the person was simply resting. The head was comfortably turned. The hands were neatly folded. The face was peaceful. The photograph was supposed to reduce the rigidity of reality. Clothes that spoke instead of words. Clothes were a symbol. The best suit, a favorite dress, children's lace. The family seemed to say, "We remember who you were, even if life ended suddenly." Flowers, fabrics, details. The frame often became almost a composition of memory. Flowers, drapery, candles. Every detail softened the presence of death, made the scene quieter, less harsh, more acceptable to look at. An attempt to conquer fear, because real death is frightening. Stillness, coldness, facial changes. Victorian culture tried to make it less threatening, less chaotic, almost beautiful. The line between care and denial. And here a difficult question arises. Was it an act of love or an attempt not to face the truth? Historians do not give a clear answer, because it was both. A photo as the last version of a person. A posthumous portrait sometimes became the most perfect image of a person in his entire life, without painful grimaces, without pain, without suffering, only peace, even if there was agony before death. The disturbing truth. We see peace, but we don't see what came before it. A question for you. If you were given a choice, remembering a loved one in pain or in a calm, almost sleepy way, what would you choose? Technology that didn't forgive mistakes. Victorian photography was not instantaneous. It was slow, frugal, almost nervous. And it was this slowness that changed the way death entered the frame. Light as a constraint. Early photographic processes required enormous amounts of light. Daylight from a window, candles, sometimes elaborate reflectors. The darkroom of mourning was transformed into a makeshift studio. Curtains were opened. Furniture was moved. The stage was literally built around the body. Long seconds of stillness. The exposure could last for tens of seconds, and sometimes longer. Living people had to freeze, not blink, not stagger, not breathe too noticeably. And here a cruel irony arose. The dead were the most ideal models. Holders for the living. To avoid blurring, they used clamps, metal stands, head supports, invisible structures behind the back. Even the living looked a little unnatural, too flat, too frozen. Why posthumous photos are sometimes sharper. There is a strange effect in old portraits. Sometimes a dead person looks sharper than the living next to him, because he did not move at all. And the living, no matter how restrained they were, remained alive. Micro movements, a barely noticeable tremor. The photo recorded this difference mercilessly. Glass plates and fragile memory. The image existed on the glass, fragile, vulnerable. One wrong move and the portrait could disappear forever. Photography was not only emotionally difficult, but also physically fragile. Mistake equals loss of moment. If the frame was spoiled, it was often impossible to repeat it. The body could already be prepared for burial. The light was changing. The state of the family, too. Therefore, the tension during the shooting was almost palpable. Photography as a test. For the photographer, technical precision. For the family, emotional endurance. Standing next to the body, not moving, looking into the dark lens, waiting. The silence of the exposure. These were the longest seconds. The clock is ticking, the candle is crackling, nobody is speaking, and somewhere between light and shadow, the last portrait is born. Technology creates an atmosphere. The slowness of the process made the scene almost ritualistic, not a click, not a moment, but waiting, tense, still, almost disturbing. The gaze of a modern person. We are used to speed, to the moment, and it is difficult for us to imagine that even a farewell could last then, minutes of silence in front of the camera. The question that remains, would you be able to endure this silence? Not seconds, but long, lingering moments standing next to someone who will never be returned. When memory became an object. A posthumous photograph rarely remained just a snapshot. It became an object, a thing that was held in one's hands, that was hidden, that was treasured, a photo that was lived with the family. Such portraits were not always put on display. They were often kept in drawers, in lockets, in special albums, sometimes next to a lock of hair, almost like a relic. Medallions of memory. Miniature images were inserted into jewelry, pendants, brooches. A person literally wore memory on his chest, closer to the heart. Death as a presence in the house. In Victorian culture, the memory of the dead did not always mean distance. On the contrary, it meant continuing the connection. The photo was on the shelf, on the fireplace, in the bedroom. The deceased remained part of the space, the border between memory and pain. But here, a subtle psychological tension arose. The photo could comfort, and at the same time, tear open the wound every time the gaze lingered on it for too long. Memory healed, memory tormented. Children's portraits that never age. Photos of children were especially painful. The child remained at that age forever, did not grow up, did not change. Time moved on, and she did not. Images as proof of love. For many families, these photos were proof. We have not forgotten. We remember. You were a part of us, even after death. Modern view, a different feeling. We look and see tragedy. They looked and saw presence, connection, a shadow of life that can still be held. Photography as a form of immortality. In a world without video, without voice recordings, without digital archives, photography was almost magic. It allowed faces not to disappear, at least in an image. But there is another side. Because any material memory has a strange property. It survives those who created it. Photos remain, and sometimes the meaning is lost. And here a new fear is born. Decades later, someone finds an old portrait, without knowing the history, without knowing the names. Only the face, and a strange feeling. Who is it? Why does he look so motionless? Question for you. Would you like your image to live in someone else's drawers after your death? Without a voice, without an explanation, just like a frozen moment. The inconvenient truth. It wasn't a stranger. When a modern person first sees a Victorian post-mortem photograph, the reaction is almost always the same: shock, incomprehension, rejection. How could they do such a thing? Modern fear versus historical context. But here comes a dangerous trap. We look into the past through the morals and habits of the 21st century, through a world where death is hidden, the body is quickly taken away. Grief becomes private and almost invisible. In the Victorian era, things were different. Death was nearby. People died at home. Children, adults, the elderly. The family saw death directly, without intermediaries, without a sterile screen. Death was no exception. It was a part of life. Photography as a new form of memory. Photography was a new technology back then, a new magic, a new way to stop time. And society used it as it knew how and needed to, including for farewells. It didn't look scary to them. For the family, a posthumous portrait wasn't an act of cruelty. It was a last chance, a last gesture of love, a last attempt to save face. We see death. They saw a person. We focus on the fact of death. They focused on the fact of existence. He was with us. She was part of our lives. Photography didn't celebrate death. Photography denied forgetting. An inconvenient truth. Posthumous photography wasn't a marginal oddity. It was a socially acceptable practice, especially among the middle class, where photography was already becoming more accessible. Why does it seem terrifying to us? Because our relationship with death has changed. We have distanced it, hidden it, made it almost invisible in everyday life. And now, any direct encounter seems like something disturbingly abnormal. A story without romanticization. Does this mean that the practice was easy? No. Behind every such photo is real grief, real death, real emptiness that has already begun to grow in the house. The complexity of human response. People simultaneously suffered, loved, afraid to forget. Posthumous photography was not about strangeness. It was about loss, and a question that turns perception upside down. If death was such a common part of life, isn't it our modern fear of it that's more strange? A look into the mirror of time. Maybe we're not braver. Maybe we're just better at hiding what scares us. A question for you. Who looks stranger? A Victorian family taking a photo next to a deceased person? Or a modern society that can barely stand the mere mention of death? Dark line between memory and anxiety. A posthumous photograph looks like an act of love, and often it was. But any practice that touches on death lives on a fine line between acceptance and denial, between memory and fear. When a portrait ceases to be a comfort, for some families, a photo became a comfort, an opportunity to look, to remember, to feel a connection. For others, the opposite happened. The image became a source of pain, a reminder that cannot be turned off. The psychology of a frozen moment. A photo does not move. It does not age. It does not change. The person in the frame remains forever in the last state. And this has a strange effect. Memory stops with the image. Death without a process. Modern grief often goes through stages: shock, denial, acceptance. In the 19th century, a photo could freeze the moment of loss. as if to record death not as an event of the past, but as a constant presence. The line between love and the inability to let go. Did photography help to survive loss? Sometimes, and sometimes it made it more difficult. Because a person looked at the portrait and seemed to return to the day of death, again and again. An unsettling feeling of living death. Some posthumous photos look almost like ordinary portraits. A barely noticeable stillness, a barely strange look, a barely unnatural calm. And the brain reacts. Something is wrong. Alive or not? This uncertainty gives rise to a special anxiety. When memory becomes a ghost. The image begins to live a life of its own. It is no longer just about a person. It is about loss, about fear, about the silence that remains after. The Victorian paradox. Society sought to soften death, to make it quieter, calmer, less harsh. But sometimes, this attempt created the opposite effect. The photo looked almost alive. And that is why it is even more terrifying for future generations. Our modern fear. We are used to seeing a clear line, alive, dead. A posthumous photo blurs this line. And this causes discomfort that is difficult to explain with logic. But is it really about fear? Could it be about something deeper? About our unwillingness to look at death too directly, too honestly? A question for you. Which is more frightening, death itself or its image, which looks almost like life? The disappearance of ritual. Why the practice disappeared. No cultural practice lasts forever, even those that once seemed natural. Post-mortem photography slowly disappeared. Not suddenly, not because of a ban, but because the world changed. Death leaves the home. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, death begins to move. From the home to the hospital. Medicine becomes more institutionalized. Treatment is more centralized. People increasingly die not in their bedrooms, but behind closed doors in wards. The body becomes invisible. Previously, the family saw everything. Now, intermediaries appear between death and loved ones. Doctors, nurses, funeral services. Contact with the body becomes shorter, less intimate, less domestic. Photography is becoming widespread. And another quiet revolution. Photos are no longer a rarity. Cameras are getting cheaper. Processes are speeding up. People have dozens of pictures in their lifetime. The last portrait is no longer the only chance. Memory no longer depends on death. If there are already many photos during life, there is no need to create them afterwards. Death loses its strange role, the moment of the first portrait. Changing sensitivity. The 20th century changes attitudes towards privacy, to emotions, to the limits of the intimate. What was once an acceptable act of memory begins to be perceived as something too personal, too heavy, too disturbing. Death becomes taboo. Gradually, death is becoming distant not only physically, but also psychologically. People talk about it more quietly, less common. Images of death are being pushed out of everyday space. The posthumous photo is becoming a shock for new generations. What was the norm for the Victorians seems strange to their grandchildren. It is terrifying for great-grandchildren. Culture changes faster than memory. A lost way of saying goodbye. Something else disappears along with the practice. a special form of contact with death, a long goodbye, physical presence. The last image, created consciously. Has it become easier for us? The modern world has made death less visible, but has it made it less painful or less scary? The irony of time. We have thousands of photographs, but we often avoid the last look. The Victorians had one chance, and they looked straight ahead. Question for you. Which is more humane? To almost never see death? Or to face it openly, even in the most painful moment? Not a horror story. Look at these photos again, slowly, without rushing, without the first emotional reaction. Not as a modern viewer, but as a 19th century person. Beyond the shock, we see the strangeness. They saw memory. We see death. They saw a love that refused to disappear with the body. The photo as proof of existence. In a world where life was fragile and death frequent, the photo became the only barrier against oblivion. Not horror, the resistance of time, the silence that we misread. There is a lot of silence in these frames. Stillness, calmness, frozen faces. But silence does not mean the absence of pain. Sometimes it means an excess of it, the border between our fear and their reality. Maybe it's not the practice itself that scares us. Maybe it's the reminder that scares us. Death has always been with life, and it remains with us now. We've just learned to look the other way. The most human motive. Most of these photos are not born out of curiosity, not out of dark exoticism, but out of a simple, painful desire not to lose the face of a loved one forever. A posthumous portrait as a final gesture, a final touch of light, a final attempt to say, "You were. You were. You remain with us, at least in memory." What this story says about us. We have more images than any generation in history. But is it easier for us to accept losses? Is it easier for us to say goodbye? The irony of modernity. We photograph life incessantly, but we fear the images of death. The Victorians lived in the midst of death, and they didn't turn away. This is not about darkness. This is about the fear of oblivion, about love, about the human attempt to come to terms with the inevitable. The last question. How do you want to remember those you will lose? In fading memories? Or in an image that will remain? This is not a horror story. This is history.